Help Me Live: Why Chronic Disease is a Design Failure and How Innovation Can Fix It. Chronic diseases are rising earlier and progressing faster, yet healthcare remains designed for late stage intervention, not upstream prevention, driven by shared metabolic dysfunction, inflammation, and muscle loss. Modern chronic disease reflects a system design failure, not a lack of science. In this session, Dr. Sean Hall will explore how innovation in delivery, precision medicine, and AI can shift care upstream, restore function earlier, and make prevention more scalable. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Sean Hall.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here. The title today is Help Me Live. I spent the last 20 years of my life researching chronic diseases. And what you see before you is the cliff notes for all you back at school that would like to go to the summary at the end. If I may, sorry, that's what I'm looking for. Just as a disclaimer, I'm CEO and chairman of a biotech. We're a private company. We engineer pharmaceutical and food supplements for mid to large size pharma. So you'll get a sense on where my bias is straight up. Beyond that though, I sit on a number of charitable boards around the world. The commonality is they're all kids in rare diseases or life-threatening diseases. So my career has given me a unique perspective of life sciences, more so around the chronic illness space. So here today, especially in this country, this is our greatest challenge. It's chronic diseases, right? And when we look at it, everyone here knows what I mean when I say a chronic disease, right? No one's, okay, great, so we won't go down that far. But what I do want to point out is when we deal at the patient level, you'll have a number of patients, a large number of patients that will complain that their treatment is being undermanaged, especially when you get into areas of mental health and you get into pain, and pain is where I've focused the last 10 years. Here in the US, there's our top three: hypertension, obesity, and chronic pain. And I'm only for the purpose of this talk going to focus on those three. When we look at the adult population, so everyone above the age of 18, we see a staggering 76% of the US adult population today having at least one chronic disease. I can make that worse. 50+% with one or more. The real kick is when we look at the kids. 3 to 17. 1 in 3 children today have at least one chronic illness under treatment. That's not a hidden thing. That's actually a statement. So this is why I say I understand how we look at healthcare, and healthcare is a siloed industry. But it can't be that way moving forward, especially when we're playing with something that is not a condition. It is not a treatment. So as we move through this, keep open minds, stay treatment agnostic, and focus on the problem. So I'm really going to run this point home. When we go back to data sets going into early 2000s, and we run out to last year, and from those type of census data points, we're projecting 24, 25. The commonality you see here is our 3 top chronic illnesses, so our hypertension, our chronic pain, and our obesity are all going up. So I'm going to make a motherhood comment, and for those of you who know me, I don't do this often, but I'm going to say this: it is really clear that historically every initiative we've undertaken, every public health policy we've put out, every drug, every supplement, every intervention tool has failed. The problem has not been arrested, right? I look at this, and from my experience, there's 3 key issues. We have what we call chronic diseases, but we've got to think now outside of the medical framework and look at the stakeholders to those conditions. So food, and we're hearing this over and over and over again today. I want to talk a little bit about misinformation because I'm not a fan of social media. I want to talk about eroding trust. I want to talk about marketing. I want to talk about the lifestyle, especially in the US, that we choose to leave. And then beyond that, I want to point out that those patients who claim that their treatment is undermanaged, or they claim they are unmet in their needs, they're falling behind. They go off and they look for something else and they leave their primary health caregiver. And we have a further disconnect. So we are now developing a group of non-responders in chronic disease patient population. Last is the commercialization of healthcare. Doesn't matter how you look at it. Right here, right now, we're all in various countries. I'm from Australia, where we have increased cost of living, and cost is a barrier. We also have the situation, particularly in this country, where insurers like to dictate health outcome, right? So keep that in mind. JAMA, this was actually end of January, focused purely on US state level POPs. So this is an accumulation of that data for adult obesity going back 1990. And it basically says this: doesn't matter what color your skin is, what sex you are, the prevalence in obesity alone is going to increase. It does give some wonderful insights as to which subgroups of the population are more at risk. But it's not painting a pretty picture. So what I want us to do is I want us to shift our focus. We know what medicine is today. I want us to look at medicine and shift the focus into a more upstream-based model. Modern chronic diseases, such as our top three, our hypertension, our pain, our obesity, they all share very common metabolic and inflammatory roots. There's no question about that. And again, we're hearing that over and over today. These include insulin resistance, chronic low-grade inflammation, more so mitochondrial dysfunction, right? So progressing these together over time, we now are starting to see years or even decades before a formal diagnosis is made, the influence of each one of these subgroups in the disease, both at a biological point of view, so muscle loss, worsening, insulin resistance, and at a behavioral point of view where we have pain driving inactivity, and inactivity is accelerating metabolic decline, right? It's a vicious circle. So the problem, it's not always a lack of treatment options. It's coming down to how, when, and what treatment is applied, right? Bear in mind, medicine, as we know it, is siloed. So the current medical system largely intervenes after the disease has declared itself, right? Targeting these downstream signals, such as elevated blood pressure, pain scores, and so forth. And whilst this approach manages symptoms really well and can prevent acute events, it fails to address the upstream drivers that we're seeing more and more of: the metabolic dysfunction, muscle loss, inactivity, chronic inflammation. And it's these conditions that emerge, they cluster, and they worsen over time, right? So we need to shift our focus and start to treat metabolism, muscle health, pain, and function as primary targets, basically aiming to slow or reverse disease trajectory, extend lifespan, and ultimately reduce long-term dependency on otherwise reactive care. Right, so if we prompt the question, is the current US medical system, including all its dominant treatment options, adequately addressing the rise in hypertension, obesity, chronic pain, and earlier onset chronic diseases? Categorically, no. It's simply not there. As reiterated in our last lecture, the current US medical system is highly effective at late-stage disease management. Right? No two ways about it. But it's structurally inadequate to cope with chronic diseases. At looking at preventing, reversing, or slowing earlier onset, multi-morbidity type diseases, pain, muscle loss, and accelerated aging, it fails. So this is not a clinician failure. This is what we call a system design failure. So beyond medicine as we know it, I want us to look at some of the key stakeholders that influence us as practitioners, influence our patients, influence those policymakers around the medical institution. Number one, we need to recognize that social media is a behavioral modifier, and not necessarily in a good way. Number two, today as people are driving business, there's more and more false marketing claims made in food and in supplement use. We have an uneducated public. I was absolutely staggered to read that 21% of Americans today are functionally illiterate. I couldn't believe that, right? And add the rising cost of living on top of that, we now have situations where there's lack of desire to learn. We need that patient to be an active participant in their health journey. But we also have this large group seeking medical or health advice from non-qualified people. And that's because everyone has one of these. And I can guarantee you everyone in here has a social media account, right? If we look at economics, as I said before, medicine is a function of insurers. And that is fraught with a whole heap of danger, right? Cost of care, barrier of treatment is too much for some, especially as we're moving through, rising costs of living. Hospitals today, unfortunately, have a more turnover, turnout function than let's get to the root of the problem so that when you're out, you are out, right? Last, I want to mention AI. I'm being very careful how I say this considering there's so many tech people in here, but AI is not always right. I can't tell you the amount of patients, my father included, that will ring me and go, oh my God, ChatGTP just told me I have, right? My heart hits the ground every time I say that, right? At the moment, AI cannot replace that experience a healthcare provider can do, especially when we start talking about personalized and precision medicine, right? And let's face it, if you have a look at the types of patients that are hitting AI for answers, a lot you're going to find in the oncology space, right? But here's the big disconnect at all, and I do really want to drive this in. The amount of patients that look to AI for answers and believe it carte blanche is staggering. These are challenges we're up against on a day-to-day basis. So just to paint this into a cascade of events, we have our lifestyle and our environment. We've heard, and I'm not going to labor on it, ultra-processed foods, high-fat foods, adulterated foods, sedentary lifestyle, screen time, all that stuff that drives metabolic dysfunction. So here you have your insulin problems, your inflammation problems, and your early onset obesity. This drives our muscle and our functional decline. So muscle loss is now being seen in people the age of 30, right? And muscle loss is probably one of the biggest biomarkers to me about your risk of death. Because medically, especially in oncology, we look at muscle loss or premature muscle loss as an indicator for early death. So we're seeing it in people the age of 30s now. This amplifies pain. This is all happening a lot earlier. So I'm going to try and start to propose some solutions here. And again, in this, I'm going to be therapeutic agnostic because everyone has something to offer. Everyone has a world of experience in their class of patients, right? I think we must recognize that these diseases no longer are isolated diagnoses and they are biologically linked conditions and they're driven by shared metabolic dysfunction, inflammation, physical inactivity, early muscle loss, and so forth. If we accept that onset is now a lot earlier, looking at these individuals into larger, more expensive disease trajectories is the current outcome. So modern healthcare remains structured around these downstream symptoms, but upstream causes just are not there yet. We're told to tell patients eat better, move more, whilst living in an environment engineered towards sedentary behavior, ultra-processed foods, and chronic stress. So behavioral change is demanded without us first addressing key quality of life areas such as pain, fatigue, and then things like insulin resistance or loss of muscle, making adherence from a patient point of view unrealistic as opposed to more irresponsible. At the same time, poorly regulated wellness and supplement products flood the market with unsubstantiated claims. In many cases, low bioavailability products, pharma-style marketing without pharma-grade evidence. So we have a bunch of people jump off or spend lots of money around these products that neither prevent reverse disease, ultimately eroding trust into what could be a lot more legitimate medical treatments. And again, for the audience here, I use medical as a generic term for healthcare. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just give you an idea of some types of innovation happening in the background. So from my company, one of the things we specialize in is lipid nanoparticles. And we use lipid nanoparticles to repurpose drugs, more so existing drugs. So why do we do this? Because many effective compounds fail not because they lack biological activity, but because A, they don't reach target a tissue effectively, right? Or they require high systemic doses and hence produce dose-limiting side effects, not desirable. Or in a number of cases, the route of administration is invasive, like subcutaneous injection. So when we're developing new engineered platforms for re-administering drugs, we look for lower effective doses, so we're reducing the amount of the compound we're actually giving, faster onset of action, better consistency of exposure, a significant reduction in systemic side effects, thus improved safety profiles, but more so we're looking at bypassing first pass effect. Everyone understand what I mean when I say, okay, right? So in these, we favor buccal or nasal routes because everything we do focuses on the patient first, and patient compliance is big in any model that we apply across any of the life science spectrums. So in that, we have two programs underway. One is a program targeting cancer-induced bone pain and noisy plastic pain, strong data across 1,200 patients to date. Opioid sparing, which is really, really interesting because we're removing those opioid compounds from the body, pain reduction, but more importantly, significant improvements in quality of life, especially around mobility, appetite, social cohesion, and so forth. The other one is in a peptide program, and we are believers in peptides. And in that, all we're trying to do is change the route of administration. So for most people who know peptides, they're typically a sub-Q injection, and the stability of a reconstituted peptide is really, really short. You can measure it in days. The program takes the sub-Q injection away. Bear in mind, in this country alone, 30% of the adult population is teronophobic, which means scared of needles, right? In doing that, we keep the bioequivalence to the sub-Q injection up at 70+%, which is far more superior than we see in the pills that are being generated for GLP-1s. And we improve drastically the overall stability of the reconstituted peptide. That kind of gives you an idea of the work we do, right? One of my favorite companies, Eli Lilly, they have a program going on at the moment called retatrutide. Hands up if you know what retatrutide is. Okay, so quickly, zinc, semaglutide on steroids. This is a GLP-1, a GIP, and a glucagon receptor, sometimes called a GLP-3 drug. Eli Lilly dropped phase 3 data November last year, also known as Triumph-4. It's worth a look. And it is being positioned as best-in-class weight loss, but weight loss is an outcome to what the drug does. What the drug is doing, it's questioning why you would use a statin in cardiovascular disease, why you would use metformin in diabetic and insulin control. So the problem, let's start there, is the delivery is sub-Q, and once that peptide is reconstituted, the stability is 28 days, right? So it involves a pharmacy to reconstitute for the patient take it home, monthly supply. The benefit is it's a weekly injection. It's delivering near 30% mean weight reduction, but like I said, the weight reduction is an outcome to the drug. What it really does is significant improvements in HbA1c, fasting glucose, triglycerides, improvement in insulin sensitivities. And what we're seeing now is participants self-reporting improvements in physical function, activity, knee pain, and more recently, and I didn't get to put this into the presentation, in tumor reduction. This is something well worth having a look at because this is, in my mind, that type of apex medicine that will make us rethink how we diagnose and treat several diseases in the one. In both cases, it would be remiss of me not to say that history is our greatest teacher. And in that, there's an old cliche that every inventor or every invention stands on the shoulders of giants. And when we look at what we're doing at Medlab and when we're looking at what Eli Lilly is doing, that is really, really true. If you have a look at some of the other, let's call them blockbuster medicines that have been over the past 20 years, I encourage everyone here, look at the past to give you a way forward, right? Especially when you start designing supplements, you design foods, you design pharmaceuticals. It is the one thing that can save years and a significant amount of money to any R&D program. Last example I want to give, this one is close to my heart. This is the Children's Cancer Institute of Australia. This is now a global initiative, and there's 14 major hospitals in the US that have signed into this initiative. What CCIA do? and clearly by the name, they specialize in kids' cancers, right? Is they perform very rapid, very comprehensive genomic and molecular profiling of each and every individual child's tumor. And they punch results in 24 hours. They have a database that taps into every drug on the global market, whether approved, used to be approved, or currently under investigation. And the outcome assigns the child to a drug, right? So what they're getting to the point is they're identifying actionable genetic markers, and from that, they're coming out with very tailored, very effective, at minimal risk, targeted therapies for the child. Doesn't matter where the drug is in the world, they can get their hands on it, right? This avoids ineffectiveness and unnecessary risk to the child. Most of their children are under the age of 14, right? So put it another way, rather than the normal one size fits all and we put people down that various type of oncology progression, this is trying to fast track to which is the drug gives you the best exposure efficaciously and with minimal risk. So this takes me to where is AI? And I'll be honest, I'm a fan of AI, but I'm going to also say in the same vein that we're at very, very, very early days. It's not there yet, right? And we need a balanced approach when we look at this. Bear in mind what I said before, a number of patients use AI for autonomous diagnosis, and we're simply not there. Where we do see AI used is software as a medical device, such as imaging. In drug development world, target identification, lead optimization, PK and tox predictability modeling, very little in the clinical trial design stage, but more so in the patient optimization and stratification areas, right? And we see the FDA today using it more so in change control plans and to some extent in drug development support. Where we're not seeing it at the clinician level is autonomous diagnosis, and this is due to what would be narrow, non-representative data sets to either the clinician's patient cohort or to a trial cohort. Validation gets a little bit wonky, especially when we start looking at using AI in actual clinical design or clinical trial execution, right? And there's algorithmic fragility, where it's not aligned to changes in practice or population changes, such as what we saw in COVID, where everything seemed to change overnight. When we ask why, my group comes back to me and says AI has a number of significant limitations around privacy and consent. So that's obviously my legal team throwing that at me, right? Quality of data sets and algorithmic bias are very questionable. More so what keeps coming back, and this is more so from my friends in university, they keep talking about this thing called a black box. And when you get to the guts of it, they don't understand the AI decision process. And if they can't follow the AI decision process, they can't validate it. This is a problem that's been echoed at TGA, FDA, Health Canada, and EMA, which are the four major bodies that register most of the drugs that we see around the world. Okay, so where do we go from here? We frame up the challenge. First, we need to accept what's happened with chronic diseases in the past hasn't worked. We need to look at a new way in approaching it forward. So if we look at the fact that these are clustered, these are upstream driven, and these are accelerated earlier in life, but our current healthcare model is optimized to late stage single disease prevention, if we don't do something, the consequences are predictable, right? So in that, we need to look at various parallels that we can put forward, we can work towards in order to change a medical system to suit today's patient. So in that, from my point of view, from my team's point of view, our immediate steps would be reposition the patient as an active participant. We still have too many patients that are along for the journey, but not responsible for their own journey, right? So in that, we forget the lifestyle prescriptions and we prioritize pain, fatigue, mobility, and inflammation recovery first. We use that to get some early wins with the patient. We promote education, we open dialogue, and we build them into their journey, right? We remove therapeutic barriers, so we support innovation companies providing said innovation, right? Whether that's in med tech or drug tech or nutri-tech, And we look at ways at developing faster market approvals and access models. We have to build guardrails around misinformation. I won't labor on this point. I think you all know what I mean if I put social media in the same context of that statement, right? And maybe ways in doing this is looking at some credibility marker for a doctor or a researcher based on their vocation, their research. So a reader can identify quality material versus potentially BS marketing material. And on that, I'm really pushing out to those influencers out there that end everything with, use my code and get 25% off, right? When it comes to healthcare, we've got to be a little bit more serious. We need to improve where AI works. To that, to me, a logical step for AI is to move into triage, right? If it has good data points, it can offer up high confidence triage models. From a hospital point of view, from a patient point of view, from a physician's point of view, that could be invaluable. Beyond that, I would build out the PK and tox modeling capabilities so that it can be used in clinical trial evidentiary support, right? And then I would adjust insurer protocols so coverage offers flexibility and coverage rewards and incentivizes prevention, because we're not doing it. Longer term, we redefine and treat chronic diseases as a cluster, and we jump into quality of life matters first and foremost. We build out precision care models because every patient is different. The cookie cutter doesn't work anymore. I can remember when I studied medicine, everything was flowchart. If, and I was lucky. I had two good profs in my early years who rewarded us to think about the model, not regurgitate the model, right? And I see some people nodding, so I think they get where I'm going with that, right? We focus AI on becoming the clinician's co-pilot, not replacing the clinician, right? The clinician is always going to know information about their patient population that is not going to be in their records, right? We doctors are the worst record keepers out there. Our insurance companies like to remind us of this periodically, right? But knowing intrinsically that person is key. So I think the best step AI can take is become the clinician's co-pilot and move forward. Last, I really do believe we need to redefine what food is, not this ultra-processed stuff that we have today. So here's your tailwind. I grabbed these from social media a couple of weeks ago. The headline is 1 in 3 children have chronic diseases. The other one from News 10 back home in Australia is the city of San Francisco is suing Nestle, Johnson & Johnson, and every other food manufacturer under the sun for poisoning people in their city with foods, right? So closing remarks, I want to be honest, if chronic diseases were a startup, we would have shut it down years ago. That's the corporate side of me speaking, right? They have terrible user outcomes, catastrophic economics, zero scalability, and a product roadmap that it just starts far too late. But yet, to be perfectly honest, it's one of the fastest growing industries on the planet. So in saying that, we don't have a chronic disease crisis, we have an upstream neglect crisis. This is where we have to change to, right? So here's the uncomfortable truth though. Most chronic diseases are not discovered, they're allowed to mature. I think deep down we know that. So if we address these signals now, if there are ways that we can restructure health policy, we give our patients a fighting chance. Real innovation is about designing delivery as well as the drug, precision that replaces averages, functional matters more than biomarkers, and prevention is more profitable than progression itself. Right? So outside that, I personally believe if we don't redesign healthcare intentionally, chronic diseases will continue to scale at fault. And unfortunately, unlike technology, biology doesn't forgive bad architecture. Ladies and gentlemen, references are there. Thank you very much. I can see the URL wasn't dropped in my presentation. If you email me, I'm more than happy to give you a copy of the slides. Cheers.